Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Hello.
Nice to see you both.
So lovely to see you too.
To all of our guests, viewers, listeners, wherever you are in the world, welcome to another evening of DMTV. I'm joined now by two dear friends and sharpest minds of my generation, Michael Brooks, who finds us from New York City, if I'm not mistaken, and Grace Blakeley, who's hiding out in Surrey, if I'm not mistaken.
Hampshire, actually.
I should have inquired before.
Minus the new.
I'm so glad to have you here for two reasons. One, because you're my friends and it's just fun to see your faces. It's been a while. Yeah. And the other, because we've convened a very important discussion. Now, we here at DMTV, we like to have wide-ranging political discussions on issues as different as Srečko Horvat's mythological reflections on our apocalyptic present to the hard political economic realities that we are entering. And I encourage you all to subscribe, to join, to donate to DM25, but we're very happy to have you here. Now, because I deeply value and respect you both as such sharp political analysts in your own right, I thought we could spend this session, this hour we have together, being a bit methodical, almost medical, in how we're going to kind of approach this very daunting question of where to for the left in our respective contexts. Myself speaking here, I guess from a continental, from a European perspective, what's happening here. Grace speaking about what's happening across the UK. And Michael, maybe you can give us a sense of what's happening in the United States now that the Bernie campaign has finally closed its doors. So I thought we might start with just a quick sort of snap diagnosis. You know, where are we now? Yeah, let's start there. Grace, what do you think? Where are we now?
So where are we now for the left? And where are we now, I suppose, for the UK and for the global economy, which is, I suppose, my area of expertise. I'll try and address them both very quickly. I think for the left, we are now closer to a historical norm for what has been the British left, which was the historically, the coalition of progressive forces that has provided the foundations for the left, both within and outside the Labour Party in the UK, has comprised the trade union movement, the various social movements, feminist movements, peace movements, whatever. And there has always been a kind of parallel movement between what was going on in the Labour left, what was going on in the wider left. Now, obviously, in line with the kind of end of history moment that we saw all around the world, those progressive forces were weakened from the 1980s onwards, not least the Labour movement. And we ended up getting to the beginnings of the Corbyn moment with a very weak Labour movement, a kind of dislocated set of not particularly unified social forces, organised in often quite powerful forms of protest, but not necessarily in a kind of hegemonic strategy. So when the Corbyn moment came, we had fairly weak progressive forces, and then suddenly we had this fairly strong electoral project, and the Labour left, in a kind of historical reversal, came out ahead of the remainder of the UK's progressive forces. Now I think we're reverting to a kind of historical norm, which is we are trying to rebuild the strength of the Labour movement, of various social movements, of community institutions, of the kind of wider, basic political institutions and associations outside of electoral politics, whilst also seeking to hold on to the gains that have been made within the Labour Party. And that's obviously all taking place in the context of, I can talk a little bit more about the economic implications of the current pandemic, both for the UK and for the global economy, but we're doing that in the context of a complete reshaping, not just of global capitalism, but also of global political economy, as in the kind of power structures that exist below the surface of those kind of immediate economic institutions and political institutions. And I've argued, the left for a long time in the UK has cohered around a critique of austerity, which has been the kind of shrinking of the British state in response to the increase in government debt that came about after the 2008 financial crisis and all the kind of various issues that's caused. But the thing that we're facing now is, of course, the expansion in the size of the state under the Conservative Party, but oriented towards a very particular project, which is, of course, shoring up the strength of British capital. So I think we are at the same time as we're kind of trying to build out those progressive forces and move from a solely kind of electoral or predominantly electoral project to a much broader social project. We're also looking at extending the critique from just, the government wasn't spending too much to actually looking at the kind of class basis of the British state, and saying, right, well, we are now moving to a situation where it's not just, we're not just critiquing the government because they're not, providing workers with enough money or providing nurses with enough wages, which of course they aren't doing. But what they are also doing is actually spending a lot more to support business, to support British capitalism. And I think we're kind of trying to develop a critique about basically develop a critique of the capitalist state, right? Which is obviously an area that the left, I think, all around the world has had trouble with. And I think that will become even more important as actually most states veer into the territory of kind of state monopoly capitalism as this crisis comes to an end. I can talk about that a bit later, but I will stop there.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful to set the table in the context that you provided, which is that, here we are in the midst of this tremendous crisis. And typically on the left, we like to say things like every crisis is an opportunity. And we want to approach these moments of radical rupture as also opportunities for us to advance a certain critique, whether that's of the capitalist state or 10 years ago of the financial industry that was clearly, red-handedly responsible for the crisis then. But we come at this, I think, with an extra dose of cynicism, which I don't hear in your very cheery tone, and which I really appreciate. But I know you've written a lot about a decade lost in many ways, at least it can feel that way, that we had what was then hailed as the financial crisis of the century that yielded very little, or at least it gave the perception that it yielded very little in the wake of certain defeats, electoral defeats, in the case of Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom, and of course now in the second round for Bernie Sanders. So I pass it back to, reflecting on that decade, just to orient us, Michael. Where do you think we are? And how do we make sense of kind of whether we are positioned, let's say, as the left, as a progressive left, to take advantage of this moment, given the radical rupture that the pandemic has brought?
Well, first of all, it's really a great pleasure and honor to be here. And it is very, very good to reconnect with you, David. It's been too long. And Grace and I, we had our first conversation a couple of weeks ago on my show, and that was great. And I'm really glad after, I think people, at least a year, I'd gotten those, you need to have Grace Blakeley on messages, which I'm glad I responded to, because for people in the audience, those kind of pushes can go both ways if they get too annoying. But I'm very glad that I listened, but it was helpful that I read and appreciate Grace's work anyways. Very much so. So I want to just stipulate, and this is going to be kind of Shreko of me in a certain way, that we have to just adopt the attitude that we have an opportunity now, even if the objective conditions are very bad. So I want to play with that paradox. I think objectively, there's big holes and a lot of problems here. And subjectively, there's hope as long as we're breathing. That we have to have some sense that there's a potential here. I think in the last 10 years, if we want to take that frame and look at the results, particularly in the United States, Bernie Sanders really was, and contrary to, I think some people in the more sort of mainstream progressive politics who wanted to frame him as sort of like, hey, he's actually not that threatening. He's just kind of like a New Deal Democrat, which on a policy level, sure, he was in many respects. And then also people who had this kind of subcultural, like, oh, well, forget Bernie Sanders. He's not quoting Mao. We're obviously not interested in his campaign. The truth was that campaign was extraordinarily important, both of them. And it was important both because of the policy agenda that he was putting forward, which would even a fraction of which would really reduce human suffering in the United States and reset political parameters here, and also internationally, because of the influence that the United States still has. And I think that's a very important part of particularly this last campaign. There's some things that I actually think were better in 2016, but one thing that improved in 2020 was a very interesting moves on foreign policy. So we tried to do, and I think this is also true in the UK, these kind of bank shots. We had these incredible Obi-Wan Kenobi figures that were like out in the wilderness. And all of a sudden they met material conditions and we discovered them. And it was, oh my God, these are really exceptional leaders. And maybe by getting to the presidency or becoming prime minister, we can sort of skip, not skip, but we can kind of mitigate decades of just complete retreat. The decimation of the labor movement, the consolidation of global trade regimes that, you know, favor the corporate sector and so on. The fact that there was 10 years that were on a policy level lost during the recession. I mean, we've seen positive and negative outgrowths of the recession, right? In some respects, you could say Occupy is a positive response. Trump in some ways is a negative response, a lagging indicator. And now we'll see, my God, what comes out of what we're experiencing now. So I think that Bernie losing is objectively very bad. And I think that we can see, you know, Syriza, how they were put down, Corbyn losing, Bernie losing, that there was kind of a moment here that got rolled back. And now the question becomes, and where there's an opportunity, is that certainly in the United States, a lot of people were essentially trained in politics by the Bernie Sanders campaign. They have expertise now in making phone calls and organizing neighborhoods and speaking to people about the issues that shape their lives. Where does that go? Then the other thing that's horrible, but objectively true, is that, you know, there's going to be a lot more people interested in our politics because conditions are facilitating that. You know, 6 weeks ago when Joe Biden said you don't want to lose your employee provided health care, yes, I think single payer is a winning message, but I also think it was a bit diluted to not see that sort of safety appealed to a fair amount of voters, particularly in the Democratic Party, in fact. Well, 33 million people have just lost their jobs. And there's an enormous amount of consequences in terms of people's healthcare. So like with 2008, and maybe even more so, there's a lot of people that are going to be really receptive to our message. And there's going to be people that have the training from the Sanders campaign and elsewhere to meet that moment. Now, and I'll talk about this maybe more later, I think that there is a lot of problems and bad habits in the left that will hurt the ability to effectively reach those people. And we need to make sure that we don't fall into posturing and subculturalism and fantasy and all of these other things that I rail on about. And the last thing I'll say for now is it seems to me that we really need to, on the political level, especially in the United States, particularly in the United States, I think this is probably less so in the UK, we need to have a relationship with organized labor, including ones that, you know, very lazily and very pejoratively, like, oh, you know, why did this union endorse Biden? Or why is this particular official so close with some, you know, undesirable member of the Democratic Party? And there needs to be much more understanding in the kind of new emergent, downwardly mobile professional class left, that a lot of that is due to people trying to protect what little they have left in very difficult circumstances. And I don't see any path forward without that energy getting transferred to a specific broad-based labor agenda. So I think that's where our energy needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to think about the similarities and the differences between the Anglo experience, which I think really shares a lot, not least because, you know, the kind of model of the liberal market economy was broadly symmetrical. I mean, you can make a lot of comparisons about the evisceration of organized labor over the same period. Whereas you look at the continent, and it's a very different situation, but you would say is equally dire for the left. And one of the things that's really interesting, I think, is that we share is just, I mean, I'm more skeptical than you are a bit, and this, Michael, and we'll get into this, about the potential for crisis to really deliver our salvation. Now, I'll give one example from Europe before we turn to the rest of the kind of analysis that I hope to train you guys on, which is just the establishment, broadly speaking, is just tremendously creative at these acts of sort of co-opting and neutralizing challengers. Now, you mentioned one, which is that the establishment actively and outright repressed left-wing challengers like Syriza and Podemos in the case of Europe, that actually deployed a body called the Troika, the most evil name the Star Wars writers' room could come up with, to repress a left-wing uprising. But they've been far more creative in neutralizing right populist threats by adopting their rhetoric, by assuming their policies on migration. You know, we often underestimate the creativity of capital. This is something you read a lot about, Grace, but also the creativity of these political entrepreneurs who are able to basically consolidate power towards the center. Now, if you'll permit me the kind of political sciencism, I thought it might be helpful if we did this slightly more systematically in terms of thinking about these three different levels of where we might look for transformation. The first level is at the micro level. I want to get your guys' thoughts on how do we feel like people's preferences are changing as a result of the pandemic? Because I think we're witnessing a revolution in social policy preferences in terms of people's understanding of what they expect from the state, what they expect from social services, et cetera. So I want to start at that micro level. Then I want to move to the meso level that you mentioned, Michael, which is where are the institutions, the media institutions, what are they doing? Where are the unions? Where are the social movements? You know, we had the radical emergence of groups like Momentum, groups like the Democratic Socialists of America. What is the future for them without the figurehead, right? If they're not geared toward the 2019 general election, the 2020 presidential election, what role will those media institutions have at the meso level? And then finally, we graduate to the big boss, to the parties. And I want us to answer the question, you know, what are we going to do with these decrepit institutions that are for sure past their sell-by dates, and yet we can't really do anything with them? So let's start that micro level, and I'll turn it back to you, Grace. You know, do we think that there's a durable transformation in people's preferences? Or how sticky is what's happening here? Are people just going to forget that we had this experience when if we ever have that V-shaped recovery? What do you think is going to happen to people's preferences about their relationship to the state? We can't hear you. I don't know why we can't hear you.
Did you mute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, I just muted and unmuted myself, but whatever.
Wonderful.
I'm going to start by saying something very provocative, which is that I'm challenging the foundations of your question because I do not believe that we can get a profound look at the kind of political economic balance of power, I suppose, or you know, the mood of society by looking at a kind of individualized notion of preferences, right? Where you could get someone to answer a survey and say, give me your preferences. In fact, that is exactly the thing that I learned most from the election of 2019, right? Which is that when you line people up and you say, what do you think about free broadband? What do you think about paying nurses more? What do you think about even just taxing people more to, you know, provide more infrastructure or whatever you're talking about? Everyone says, yes, this is all something that I broadly agree with. And then when it came down to that offer being made to the electorate in the December general election by Jeremy Corbyn, by the Labour Party, there was a huge amount of resistance. Now, obviously, part of that comes down to Corbyn, who was, you know, obviously eviscerated by the British press. Part of it comes down to the Brexit question, which was, you know, put the Labour Party in a very, very difficult position by December 2019. But also a big part of it, and something that I thought a lot about when I was on the doorstep canvassing and talking to voters, was that we still got the how are you going to pay for it question. And I did a lot of thinking about this and talked to a lot of people about it. And I think that how are you going to pay for it question is not, because we often responded to that by saying, look, okay, governments issue bonds. When they issue bonds to finance public spending, that increases GDP over the long run. They boost tax revenues, which allows them to repay those bonds. Those bonds are in your pension funds. That allows you to save as well as boosting the size of the economy long term. People will have tuned out by the time I said the word government bonds, right? People aren't asking for an explanation of how public spending works. They're not asking for a debate about austerity. Or most people see when they hear a debate about austerity as one expert saying it works, one expert saying it doesn't. I think the kind of stickiness of that argument or of that question, how are you going to pay for it, is rooted in people's lived experience of exploitation and oppression under capitalism. The logic is basically, I am suffering. I couldn't afford to take out a massive loan to send my child to university or to improve my life chances, even though I think if I was given that opportunity, that would work for me. there are so many constraints on my capacity to be the person I think I could be. Why should that be any different when we look at society as a whole? And I think that's a question that we really haven't asked. We've been very clever at saying, you know, and I've been guilty about this as much as anyone, at saying, look, here are the economic reasons why austerity doesn't work, and here are the really clever reasons why it's actually going to be better for everyone long term if we spend lots of money. I don't think that's the question that people were asking. They were saying, why should I believe you that you could make my life better when my life is bad and it feels like it's getting worse? And people, obviously, in the context of there being almost no trust in politicians whatsoever. So people are going to respond to surveys, and they have been responding to surveys saying our policy preferences have changed. You know, I can't remember what the survey was today. It was 75% of people favoured, this is a survey by Unite, the union in the UK, so do look it up, saying that they favoured, you know, really radical policy changes in the UK in the wake of this crisis. Things like moving to a national living wage for most key workers, those sorts of things. And so I think, you know, that will definitely play out. We'll I think, see some support for the idea of, you know, a post-crisis reconstruction along the lines of a Green New Deal. We'll obviously have much greater levels of social support for public service workers, for, you know, basically anyone working in retail, hospitality, jobs that have either been cut massively or where people have been on the front line providing for everyone else during the lockdown. I think there will be an increasing sense that these people need to have, you know, in the UK, a higher minimum wage, you know, better access to public services, and in the US, probably, you know, healthcare of some kind. But whether or not that translates into a social project that says, right, okay, let's take basically, you know, let's completely transform the foundations of our society and tip power that is currently, you know, weighted against working people. Let's try and, you know, rebalance that power and hand it back to working people. I think we are still going to come up against the challenge of basically capitalist realism, which is a challenge of the sense of possibility that people have about changing the world. And I think the biggest issue there is not an intellectual challenge. It's not that people don't think that we can't change, it's not that people think we can't change the world because they don't understand how that would work. I think a lot of people have an intuitive understanding that actually, you know, the problem is that the people at the top, whether the politicians, the, you know, media executives, the CEOs, whatever, have too much power and everyone else is being screwed over. I think there is a challenge in the sense that neoliberalism and financialization begets this individualization of society, where people look at these problems as individuals and say, what can I do to deal with this? What can I do to stop climate change? Oh, well, you can, you know, stop using plastic straws and recycle your waste. And people do that, but then they think, oh, you know, this doesn't feel quite right. It's because we've lost that sense of collective power that was once the foundation of the left, but which has been eroded for all those different reasons, you know, the decline of the labor movement, the just, you know, like the discursive shift that happens under neoliberalism that moved to kind of consumer culture, all these different sorts of things. And that's why, you know, I started this by saying the challenge that we face now is really to build up those social institutions that provide the foundations for a much wider social movement. Because I think by participating in a movement that is aimed at changing things, even if it never succeeds, just the participation changes your view of humanity. You stop thinking everyone's bad and they're all out to get each other. You start thinking, oh, actually, you know, if we work together, we can change things. And about the desirability and the feasibility of social change. And I think that's something that's really going to shift during this crisis, which is why perhaps you sense a slightly higher level of optimism in my voice, David, because people are literally volunteering their time to join these mutual aid groups in order to help other people, help, you know, nurses, elderly people, whatever. And I think in doing that, they're realizing that pretty much, you know, a lot of other people are in the same situation as them. A lot of other people in society want the same things as them, which is, you know, enough to get by themselves and a healthy and happy society more broadly. And they're creating the networks to are allowing them to meet one another. So I think if the progressive movement is able to take advantage of that and actually build out those organic social links that are now re-emerging between people within societies all over the world, that's potentially, you know, an amazing opportunity to rebuild. But obviously, I could talk for a very, very long time as well about the massive challenges we're going to face, because I'm by no means kind of Pollyanna-ish, because capital is incredibly creative. And, as you said, the ruling classes will use this as an opportunity to consolidate their power. And I can see, and I could tell you in detail, we'll perhaps do that when we get onto the macro level, the multiple ways in which they are already doing that. And I think those increasingly close links between big businesses, big monopolies, which are going to become increasingly powerful as this crisis wears on, and the state is really where we need to be looking in future. But I'm also optimistic, because I do think that, we are seeing an erosion of that very individualistic subjectivity that underpinned neoliberalism. And hopefully if that lasts, then that will really be the catalyst for much wider change.
I want all of our viewers to know that I actually sent these questions to Michael and to Grace before. So she could have easily responded to me in email and said, no, I disagree with the foundation of your question, but she chose to humiliate me live on air. I just want everyone to know that. Friend. But Michael, I'm curious, so I don't disagree with anything that you said, Grace. I completely agree with you. And I'm glad you just eviscerated the discipline of political science in very handily 1 minute and 30
seconds. As a political economist, that is my job.
Of course, I'm all for it. But, Michael, I think it might be slightly different in the United States. And the reason why I think so is because the polling political industrial complex is vast. Sitting politicians actually at least pretend to care about the polling numbers that arrive on their desks. Right now, you spoke a bit about the changing conditions that might produce a shift in, let's say, the Biden campaign's position on healthcare or on.
I would doubt that. I would question the foundation of that. No.
But let me put this same question.
Questioning David's foundations is going to.
Yeah, David's foundations are getting questions.
Let me put the same question back to you about, do you agree with Grace that ultimately the underlying distribution of preferences is little more than a stat on a page that doesn't really translate into a political outcome without a meaningful movement that can translate into a lived experience that can overcome a lot of the evisceration, subjugation? Or do we think that the raw input, the raw experience of the pandemic, like Boris Johnson's near-death experience in the hospital, might make us different people at the end of this and might, in its own right, produce a different kind of politics?
So 3 things come to mind. One is, I think that the raw inputs you're talking about have already been happening. So in the United States, there's already more receptivity to things like Medicare for all, or something that was completely marginal, not in any way on the map politically, is on the map. I was on a show recently with Robert Wright, who is very great public intellectual here. Certainly not somebody on the right. He's not a right-wing figure at all, but he doesn't he doesn't think of himself as being particularly left. And he's like, yeah, I don't think Medicare for all is really a left position anymore. I mean, the way it's sort of operated in the culture and in the policy conversation. So I think those inputs are coming in, and I think that this will only increase those inputs. Now, where I would question the foundations of it, and David, to be fair to me, I didn't read the questions. So I'm not trying to embarrass you on air. I just gave it a quick scan, and I have so much confidence in you that I didn't bother reading it in detail. So let me just say, no, I think that behind these different policy moves, and particularly in the United States, but I would suspect this is true elsewhere, is, are you hunting for a return to normalcy, or are you hunting for some type of big macro change? A vast majority of voters are looking for a return to normalcy, however they would define it. Now, in some ways, that might be a positive signal, because as much as there is a serious rise in xenophobia and racist rhetoric and the Trump administration and so on, if you look at the polling, not for things like, and this is where my subculturalism critique comes in. No, most American voters do not want open borders or, like a slogan at a meeting, but actually most American voters are increasingly tolerant and decent about immigration, as an example. And they don't see that as like a left extremist demand. And they also don't resonate with demonizing and terrorizing immigrants, as an example. And then I think there's plenty of people who are increasingly receptive to those interventions in policy because they see that somewhat correctly as a way of getting back to some type of idea of normal, right? So if 20, 30 years ago, you could work a little bit less, maybe have a little bit more, this kind of policy agenda fits with an idea of, I would like to get back to some sense of stability in my life. And, you know, this has been very difficult in the Democratic Party, and a thread that, you know, a circle that Bernie couldn't sort of square, right? Because on one hand, the overriding interest of Democratic Party voters is simply to defeat Trump. It is not strongly ideological at all. And he had to figure out a way of basically saying, if you want some return to normal, we have to do some of these big picture reforms. And that's a hard argument. I think it's easier to make now, post-pandemic, but the motivations are different. I think as far as making those things durable, it to me, it always does, again, in the United States, I think universally, maybe it's just my bias, I think labor power is the only organized, coherent, and systemic way of grounding that, because it reframes the labor frame of, on one hand, we're in politics for actually very clear self-interest. We want to improve our power at the bargaining table, improve our living standards, and this is pure, healthy self-interest. And at the same time, because it's not motivated by a sort of flickering of opinion or this or that moral sentiment, I think it's much more grounded and much more durable. And I think that that's something that's is very much missing in the United States, both ideologically and structurally. That it was a different time, historically. When you had 1 out of every 3 workers in the United States in a union household, and some propagandist attacked labor, the social consequence of that is very different, because you're not talking about some abstracted group that you probably have no interaction with. You're talking about certainly either very likely you or people that you know personally. So I guess my 3 steps here are, I think the inputs are changing, but I don't know if people's underlying motives and what they want out of politics are changing. And I think that that's a distinction we have to make. And that interest in normalcy has to be something that we work with constructively, because I think, again, we aren't just going to return to quote unquote normal, and nor should we want to, particularly coming from our politics. But at the same time, we can't be people who are just constantly rhetorically, stylistically at war with, in the main, what people want, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. I mean, I think that both of you are already pointing to this meso level that I mentioned, that maybe we do a sort of quick round on that, because it's the timing of, let's say, the general election in the UK, and let's say the end of the Bernie campaign. I mean, this is not a long time. This is a 4-month period where vast electoral ambitions kind of, came to little in the end, we might say. And so these institutions that, for better or for worse, cohered around either the candidacy of someone or the party leadership of another, there's questions about what role they play. Now, Grace, you hinted at what role they might continue to play, doing things like mutual aid. And in the case of the United States, there's obviously ample opportunity to be contesting elections lower down. But let's just do a quick round. When it comes to these meso-level institutions, how are they doing? Did they need that figurehead in the first place? Are they going to find a new confidence in the context of this pandemic? What should we think about the prospects for many of these institutions that have brought young people into politics really for the first time because they were cool, they were sexy, they were fun, and they gave a social experience to what's otherwise a quite atomizing moment of just putting your ballot down on a piece of paper in the ballot box?
Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to start by just contextualizing this a bit by bringing kind of pulling in something that Michael just said, which is this idea that people are motivated politically often by a desire to kind of return to normalcy. And I think that's a really important point to bring up, because this is basically why things didn't go the way that many on the left supposed in the wake of the financial crisis. This is actually interesting to kind of get back into the political scientist or, you know, liberal politics mode. This is actually something that Tocqueville said, which is that crises aren't moments when people are most oriented or that are most desirous of kind of, you know, dramatic change, because it's during the depth of a very deep crisis, people think, right, you know, 6 months ago things are normal, in 6 months' time I want things to be normal again. It's actually during long periods of stagnation after crises or between crises that people become more radicalized, because people slowly start to realize, right, things aren't going to go back to normal if we just leave them the way they are. That you know, there's a reason that the Corbyn and Sanders campaigns only kicked off you know, a fair amount of time after the financial crisis, and why in a lot of places across Europe where it happened before, there was actually, this was based on a realization that only profound change was ever going to bring things back to normal. So I think this point about normalcy is very important. And yeah, it kind of, you know, it suggests a different tone or a different discourse, rather than saying, you know, we need radical policies that are going to tear everything up, which is often how like we like to talk, because, you know, that's what we do. Like, I was expelled from like all my schools. That's just like the way I like to orient myself towards power. It's just like tear everything up because that's fun. But actually, that's not how most people, you know, want to talk and think about politics. They see it as something that is, you know, as Michael said, like talking about like based on this desire for stability and order. And that's where I think this idea of, you know, we're already at this stage really where a lot of people realize that, you know, okay, things aren't ever going to go back to the 1990s. Despite the fact that there are a lot of political parties, centrist political parties, who are basically founded on the basis that it was possible to return to the 1990s. A lot of people realize that's not going to happen anymore. So the question then is where next? And obviously the far right was coming up with quite a powerful narrative to say, you know, to suggest their framing of that. I think, you know, building on my answer to the last question, it is actually going to be at that meso level where those answers are formulated. Because people are only going to really get us, you know, it's all very well having abstract and ideological and utopian visions for the future, and I think those are important. You know, we can look to the post-crisis world and say we're going to have we're not just going to, you know, rebuild society as it was before. Most people, according to the polling, don't want that. We are going to try and actually deal with some of the fundamental injustices that have led to or exacerbated this crisis, and do so along the lines of something like a Green New Deal. And that's a good, you know, figurehead almost to have in people's minds, because it helps at the very least to kind of orient a movement. But it is actually going to be, I think, in, you know, active political engagement that these answers are formed and gain meaning for the vast majority of people. And that will be obviously, you know, in the course of both struggles within the labour movement and struggles that are increasingly going to be taking place just for people to be able to sustain themselves and acquire the bare minimum that they need to survive. And they will be doing so in communities that will emerge around, you know, around those points of struggle. I think how the left engages with those organic struggles that will emerge over the coming months, and how we also reform the organizations that were initially founded to provide that purpose, so particularly the labour movement, is really going to be the question that we have to face. And, you know, in the UK, we obviously have the Labour Party, which, yeah, I mean, talking about the Labour Party and its place in the wider left is, as political scientists and historians and politicians for a very long time have noted, a challenging task because of the kind of supremacy that the Labour Party has on the British left. But we do really need to be thinking about orientation towards the labour movement in particular, which obviously has a close relationship with the Labour Party, and to, as I was talking about, those kind of community-based and wider social struggles. And I think there are, you know, several ways in which we can do that. But I think in the UK, there needs to be a strategy, and there is slowly developing a strategy to use momentum, which is this vehicle that emerged as a kind of within and outside the Labour Party organisation for the left, to organise within the party, within the labour movement, and within, you know, wider, basically to engage in wider community organising as well. That all requires the left to be united It requires us to be able to put forward and vote for a slate of people that are going to then take on leadership roles within Momentum, and then to do the same thing within the Labour Party, to do the same thing within the Labour movement. And that question of unity is the big challenge when you don't have a figurehead. That is where the leadership really, actually makes a difference, because Corbyn, Sanders, whoever else were able to bring together factions with unbelievably different views. If you put them in a room together, they'd just start gouging each other's eyes out about various obscure interpretations of, Marxism or whatever. Corbyn united them around a project. And without that leadership, it's much, much harder to unite people. But it's also the sign of a politically mature movement that people are able to unite without that powerful figurehead. So I don't know what's going to happen, but a bunch of us are organizing to try and make this happen, and I am perennially optimistic.
Grace is giving us such an interesting model of politics. If you're taking notes at home, micro-level preferences don't matter. Leadership does matter, but leadership is mediated by the meso-level institutions. We're not even finished with the session. So if you're taking notes at home, try to draw a diagram, and then we'll send it over. But how much does this analysis resonate with you, Michael? I mean, you spoke a lot about the need for the left to seriously engage the labor movement, but how many young people are unionized? What's the state of that meso level? It looks quite bleak on the horizon.
Yeah, so I everything she said really, really resonates with me, and this goes back to a conversation that in some ways is very boring to me, but unfortunately it just keeps popping up, which is, how do you build a healthy culture on the left, and one that actually does have dynamic and broad appeal? And I think part of this process actually that we need to paradoxically feel comfortable with is, it's that Zizek move, right? Where yes, we're in a crisis, a lot needs to happen. There's an extraordinary amount of pressure. And I think the actual immediate organic responses are constituting themselves, like Grace says. People are developing mutual aid networks. People are delivering things for each other because they need to, and because it's a matter of survival. And there's a lot of interesting terrain there of if 10,000 people can't individually pay their rent, that's something that they're each isolated and terrified about. If they come together as 10,000 people and say they won't, and they're able to organize their neighbors who can to take a collective action, well, that can actually be incredibly powerful and transformative. So all this stuff is happening right now. And I think we need to, as a left, quote unquote, really just either participate in it directly where we can and support it by, in this case, I think it's actually constructive to just say, like, I have a media platform, so it's very important that I interview Chris Smalls and listen to what he is saying about Amazon and what would be constructive. And some of that, and if you have the capacity, give their, GoFundMe $50. I mean, this is where the rubber really does kind of meet the road in a very tangible way. Now, I think, and then on the other hand, I think we actually need to sit down and read and think and clarify some things. So I always make the distinction that rights and commitments on civil rights across the board, as an example, there's certain things that are, Trump's detention camps. This is the type of issue that if I am in a 5% minority of the population, everybody else has agreed. Everybody else thinks it's fine to kidnap children because we have a quote unquote border crisis. I will be part of that, obscure 5% that says, actually, I object to that, right? Now that's important and that's clear. Now there's other issues on the left and rhetorical commitments that I think, frankly, do not carry the same material weight and are performative and totally unnecessarily alienating. So I think that when we think about how can these organizations and models, these organizations that do really important work like DSA, how can they start folding out into much broader movements, like being able to talk to people, nurses who are striking, or rent strikes, or the broader labor movement, or just even people who are sincerely apolitical in the way that a lot of people are. Most people, this is another reason. I mean, Joe Rogan, it's hilarious. He's such a perennial source of controversy. But I remember someone saying to me once, like, I don't understand, because I get that Joe Rogan really does care about everybody having healthcare, but how can he be friends with, and I don't even remember, he named some right-wing miscreant that Joe Rogan is friends with. And I said, like, you realize that 98% of Americans never would filter their like friendship preference based off of like abstract ideological agreement. Like that would never be where this starts for like any category of normal person. And by any category of normal person, I'm talking about every demographic and identity imaginable, just those that are not kind of baseline sort of immersed in politics. So the question does start to become, you can't have a mass movement that is totally embedded in an incredibly narrow set of basically professional managerial class preferences, behaviors, tendencies, and rhetoric. And I think in the overall, big picture is like the left being annoying and people can't clap at meetings or whatever. Are these the biggest things in the world? No. But from the perspective of building a left that can maintain relevancy and expand outwards, that stuff just needs to be cleaned up. So that's another tangible.
Yeah. For those of you who maybe are less familiar with the left politics in the United States, every single thing that Michael is saying right now could start a Twitter war of Napoleonic.
I apologize.
No,
I only get notifications from people I follow, so feel free to tweet at me.
Look,
probably won't even notice, but leave David and Grace alone. They are not criticizing any of the.
Michael, we court controversy.
Leave them alone. But can I just say really briefly on just to actually spell this point out, because, and again, this maybe is a very U.S. centered debate, but I've heard it. I think, unfortunately, is another toxic thing that the United States has actually exported. But some people say, like, when they hear the type of arguments I'm making, it's like, oh, okay, well, you have your own sort of presuppositions and lazy thinking about the quote unquote working class. And all you're saying is that, if you're on the left, you should put on a suit and tie and, and normie it up and at worst, like, substantively like throw the rights of people under the bus. So first of all, the second part, to be clear, is just like, that's very dishonest. And I'm going to just assume that everybody gets, as I've said, that nobody is talking about a commitment to substantive rights for anybody, right? But with the first part about how to like appeal more broadly culturally, the point is actually the opposite. The point is that if you interact with the working class of any sort in the United States, defined as people who need to work for a living, which is a very broad term, you're talking about an incredibly heterodox, this is the most diverse group of people on the planet across demographic, sexual, social backgrounds. And in a work context, these things need to be mediated and common interests need to be built. So the point is actually not, can you quote like normie it up by doing some type of like fake social conservatism? The point is, can you be as open and as tolerant as the working class is itself? And that does mean that you can't constantly be mandating speech and controlling people's this and that and throwing in all of your presuppositions. You can obviously, again, there's substantive rights. I'll keep reiterating that's not under question. But you see, like, this is a really important distinction. It is not, go reach the middle class, because that means you go somewhere in Ohio and you drink a Budweiser and you whatever. It could mean that, but it also could mean that you go to, Bayside in Queens and you're hanging out with, cab drivers from Grenada or Pakistan or whatever. They also are not going to know what the hell you're talking about a lot of the time with this stuff, and aren't going to find it usually appealing either. So the question is, can we, and in these groups, be as heterodox and as dynamic and as open as the working class itself, not conform to some reactionary version of it that we have in our heads?
I'm compelled. So we're coming, I think we have room for one last set of questions, which will really get us to this macro, kind of the $1 trillion question of what we do about power. Now, and it's explicitly electoral power. Now, both of you have touched on the need in your own ways for unity, for a certain kind of unity. Now, Grace, you spoke about this explicitly, and then Michael, you also spoke about the need to build institutions that are as heterodox in their representation, ability to channel common interests through that kind of unity. But the question remains, even if there's unity at that level, micro linked to meso levels, can it ever reach the macro level? Now, this comes back to, if I may challenge the foundations of Michael's response, which is, there's a great essay by Stuart Hall called The Great Moving Right Show, where he basically says, look, you keep waiting for things to get worse to get better. But actually, when things get worse, they usually just get worse.
Well, you're not challenging me. I agree. I agree.
but Michael, I'm just drawing from the view that people can't make rent, that suggests that they might come together for a rent strike, which is true, which is fine.
Right.
But it depends a lot on this supply side story, on the macro story, of how actually existing, and this is the tragedy of our historic moment, how actually existing parties, actually existing leaders either accommodate, reject, or otherwise marginalize certain emergent forms of political organization and give them no representation at the level of electoral politics. And this putting all these pieces together, you can easily see a situation in which this pushes the right that we have, which is we might say a neoliberal nationalist right, that combines a kind of free market perspective with a kind of nationalist authoritarian aggression, that pushes them towards the fascist, towards the socially protective but equally exclusionary politics, but is accommodating some of the kind of anxious policy preferences that, okay, we might not think they matter that much, but they may say, okay, people are starving, people need healthcare, so the right might tip over and adopt things like universal basic income. They might adopt those policies towards becoming a more like a Mussolini style right and less like a Trump or Salvini style right. Now you can equally imagine if that fails to happen, that a space could open up for a left party to actually insert itself and say, there's no offering here for the kind of transformative politics that will protect you. But my question is, in the duopolistic politics of both Britain and the United States, in a post-Corbyn period, in a post-Bernie period, is it all electorally for naught? Is all this rumbling ever going to find representation in the left parties that we have to represent us? So we've got 7 minutes left. I'm hoping you can give some, I know it's not a lot of time, but maybe we could go in around Grace and Michael, and I'll leave you guys to it to say a bit about what prospects there are for all the stuff we talked about at these bottom-up levels to find some expression at the macro or supply side level.
Yeah, so, right, I'm going to try and answer this really quickly, which is the kinds of political parties we have now. And I think, and this is actually, again, I'm going to come back to some actual political science here. I'm going to draw on, there's a brilliant book many of you will have read by Peter Mayer called Ruling the Void. He has another paper with a colleague where he talks about the cartel party, the rise of the cartel party. And this is building on a literature that exists in political science in the post-war period, where they look at the rise of the mass party, where you suddenly have the emergence of these huge political parties that bring in the labor movement, that have many, perhaps hundreds of thousands of members, and that make policy to a greater extent on a mass basis. And looking at the erosion of the mass party, which obviously begins kind of 1970s, 80s period and fully consolidates throughout the 90s and noughties, there are both kind of sociological factors and political economic factors that obviously lead to the decline of the mass party. And the emergence of the cartel party is a response. And the cartel party is basically a political party that, rather than getting its ideas, its strength in terms of resources, its campaigning strength from a mass of members, gets those things basically from a relationship with the state, and therefore with other political parties, that renders it effectively immune from popular pressure. So a cartel party is basically like colluding with state actors, the civil service, representatives of capital, lobbying organizations, and even other political parties occasionally, to basically say, we will restrict the terrain of political debates. We will make sure that the policy debate only takes place within these very restricted boundaries that effectively don't challenge the status quo. And we will make sure that, in response to the fact that we were losing members anyway, we're going to basically shut members out of the policy making process and turn towards the resources of the state and the resources of capital to fund us with our needs. And then you get the emergence of these big bureaucratic, centralized political parties purely focused on state power. So there's a structural issue there, which is the decline in participation in those parties, but there's also I suppose a more strategic issue, an issue of kind of political choice and of incentives that emerges naturally from those parties thinking, right, we're losing members, how do we adapt? And they obviously adapt in the interests of the powerful. So we end up with these cartelized political parties with no real mechanisms for the membership to influence those. And that's where we end in the UK, for example, in 2015. And that's the model that's challenged by Corbynism. And that's really what Sanders, Corbyn, it's what Syriza, it's what Podemos were about. If you look at the policies, often standard kind of social democratic stuff that in most of those countries was acceptable during the post-war period. The real challenge there was to the out-of-touch, bureaucratic, oligopolistic political elite that had emerged and was completely sealed off from the rest of society. It was people storming the castle basically and saying, right, you've got to let us in. We're part of this and we are going to play a role in making policy. Now, I think to a certain extent, the doors of that process have already been opened, partly because political participation and engagement began to increase from a historical nadir in the wake of the financial crisis. You were going to start seeing more people becoming relatively more engaged. It took on a very extreme form in the UK, where membership of the Labour Party went from a couple of 100,000 to 500,000 over a very short period of time. And in that context, it's hard to imagine a return to the neoliberal cartel party that successfully completely shuts out members and exists as this kind of bureaucratic husk. And similarly, for a lot of those new political parties throughout Europe, whether in Portugal, in Spain, whatever. And to an extent, it's similar in the US, although the DSA is obviously kind of still building up from a relatively low base. So I'm going to stop there because I've gone over time. But I think that's something to build on, is that we're not going to go back to the cartel party. As long as members are able to organize within these parties and make their demands heard, then we have power and we need to build on it. Michael?
So I was talking with a good friend of mine, Dustin Guastella, about this, and Sherrod Brown as a politician, is not the most exciting guy in the world at all, but he does have actually very important lessons for us. So he has built his career specifically, again, on a relationship with labor. And through being a point person for a specific organized constituency, he has a safe Senate seat in a state that's gone increasingly red, right? So I think there's something important about reframing. Instead of I have a particular lane in the Democratic Party, I'm going, we talk about is the Democratic Party a vehicle, or how do we use the Democratic Party? This is a concrete and tangible example of someone who has used a certain industrial labor base that still exists to ensure his political role in the Democratic Party. So I think, I don't have time to elaborate on it, but I think that example is important and people need to think on those terms. And again, I think in the United States, I think a big problem that definitely manifested in the Sanders campaign was that there was if the campaign recognized that the battle from the beginning was always between Sanders and Biden, and that most other candidates, including Warren, were afterthoughts, then you would recognize that you were actually fighting for a lot of the same basically working class constituencies across background, but that people under 45 are fed up and exhausted and see that this return to normal is not happening. And people over 45 really just want to beat Trump. And you would have had a very different kind of argument, and you might have, if it was targeted properly, started to migrate some of those older voters into, which paradoxically in the Democratic Party, an advantage of which, while they're uncomfortable with Sanders and big picture change, they also have more of an institutional memory of the New Deal. So I think if we pick our targets right, there is a possibility in terms of what coalition we're actually trying to build. But institutional barriers are huge, and if we're being clear-eyed about it, it's just a massive climb. And but we don't have the luxury of cynicism.
The last word the very last word of Michael's aside, this has been just a remarkably optimistic conversation. I don't know what lockdown has done to you both, but you seem incredibly cheery about the prospects for this. No, I think you're right, both of you, in noting that, you know, the cat is really effectively out of the bag. You know, I think if we had another hour, we could have talked, or another 3 hours, we could have talked about the transformation happening on the right, which is equally robust, equally, you know, and how those two fit together. Because of course, the mutual aid networks, we like to think that they are naturally going to give rise to a certain left politics because that's how we experience them. But just as you noted, you know, that subjectivity can tilt in either direction. So, God, anyway, we have so much to talk about.
Well, let's do more.
I hope you enjoy.
I'm down for another one.
Anytime.
Yeah, so DM TV viewers, consider this part 1 of a series with the 3 of us thinking through the transatlantic challenges that the left is up against and how that's going to confront a new tilting toward neo-fascist right on the continent and across the Atlantic to the UK and the US. I want to thank you both very much for your time on this lovely Thursday evening, and I really look forward to speaking with you both again. So thank you both from DM25, and I hope to speak again very soon.
Oh, please. Thanks so much,
David.
both of you.
Lovely to speak to you both. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Yeah.
Good night, guys. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you very soon. Take care, everyone.